evening, Bethel Park, and welcome to the Bethel Park Recreation Live Well Speaker Series. Tonight, I have the special pleasure of introducing Mike Furtick. He's a senior vice president and financial advisor at Fragasso Financial Advisors. He manages their Cold Springs location, where he works as a financial advisor, managing and moderating clients' investment portfolios. He's been in the investment industry for over 25 years. He was born in Bethel and raised here, and he currently lives with his wife and 2 children here. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Appreciate that. And welcome everyone to this presentation, as you can see on the screen, entitled Crucial Considerations for a Healthy Retirement. And you know who I am because Chuck just introduced me. So I won't bore you with that again, but I will tell you that today we're going to walk through several of the more critical aspects of your overall retirement plan. And I know when I say the words retirement plan, we automatically think about a company 401k or a 403b, and that's fair. But today I'm going to ask you to think about your retirement plan in a more global sense of the word. What type of plan do you have in place that will allow you to either retire or stay retired the way that you want? And if you say to that, well, I don't really have a plan in place, then the first thing I would say to you is welcome to the club, because most people don't have a plan in place, at least as early as they should. So I would say that our hope today is to just kind of help start you on that path toward getting that overall retirement plan started. And as you can see on the slide here, some of the more important issues to consider include your savings, income and tax, expenses, inflation, which has certainly been in the news, prudent investment practices, and a withdrawal strategy that makes sense. So we're going to touch on each of these as well as some other things along the way. And we're going to start with the topic of savings. But just as I say that, let me take a step back for a minute. And before we talk about savings, let's talk a little bit about debt, because paying off debt is certainly important anytime we start to think about what retirement might look like. Nobody wants to retire with a big pile of debt hanging over their head. So let's think about the fact that there's really just 2 types of debt. There's good debt and there's bad debt. Good debt is the type of debt that allows for greater long-term financial productivity. Examples of that would include things like buying a home versus renting, so we're building some equity, or buying a vehicle for work or for school, or maybe we buy tools or equipment for a business. Even better if some of that debt that we have has interest that is tax deductible. Bad debt, on the other hand, is created when we buy the fun stuff, right? Non-durable consumer items, and we don't pay the balances off immediately. That type of bad debt impedes our ability to do what we're going to talk about, which is building savings. The interest on bad debt is never tax deductible, and it almost always comes at a fairly high cost. You know, you don't have to think past credit card debt to understand the type of cost that's involved with that debt. I also like to talk about the 3 types of households that exist when I talk about debt. You know, you have those who spend everything that they make and aren't able to save anything. Then you have those who spend more than they make and begin to accumulate debt. And then finally, you have the last category, those who spend less than they make and they're able to save, therefore acquiring assets. So we all want to strive to be in that last category, because that allows us to begin saving, which is what we're going to talk about now. Anyone and anytime you ever think about or consider retirement, we think about our savings. How much do I need to put away? Is it going to be enough? Those are the real valid questions that we ask. But it's just as important to think about where you save that money. Should we put everything into a tax deferred account? Well, wait a minute, that might have some restrictions. What about putting some money into a taxable account that we can touch sooner if we need to? What about this other thing, this tax-free account, namely the Roth IRA? And the answer, I'd suggest anyways, for most people that makes the most sense is to put some money into each one of these buckets because they all have their own unique characteristics. The after-tax bucket, that is the first one up here, it doesn't have any limit on how much you can put in, and there are no restrictions on when you can take the money back out. The pre-tax bucket, which would include things like a company retirement plan or an IRA, that can offer a tax deduction as well as tax deferred growth. And there might even be a matching contribution from your employer. Then the Roth bucket would allow you to put money away that can grow tax-free. So I think as you consider these buckets, it becomes clear that if we can fill each one of these with some amount of funds, now we're going to have more options available down the road when it's time to start taking money out of these accounts. By the way, what I didn't mention is in the pre-tax and the Roth buckets, there are some restrictions. First of all, there's a limit as to how much you can put in, and then there are some restrictions on when you can take that back out. It's 59.5. Why they came up with the half, I don't know, but you can't touch that money without a penalty prior to age 59.5. So that's why I say maybe we don't want to just overload the money into those buckets if we think we might need to tap into some of those funds a little sooner. Now we get to turn to no one's favorite subject, taxation. And let's just talk about the fact that we need to be aware of how our income, in particular during retirement, is going to be taxed. During our working years, our wages are subject to all kinds of taxes: federal tax, state tax, local tax, FICA tax. Most states, including Pennsylvania, don't tax Social Security benefits. However, and we're going to talk a lot about Social Security is taxed at the federal level. And in fact, up to half of your Social Security income is taxable if you're an individual with total gross income, including your Social Security, by the way, of $25,000 or more, or if you're a couple filing jointly and you have more than $32,000 of income. Even more, up to 85% of your Social Security benefit is going to be taxable if you're an individual with gross income of 34 or a married couple with more than 44,000 in income. Now, if you're a retiree with little income other than Social Security, you won't be taxed on those benefits. In fact, you might not even have to file a return. But our focus for all of us should be on paying less overall taxes on our total income, because that's more that we get to keep. And a tax advantage retirement account is something that can certainly help in that regard. One of the questions that we should answer is, how much money am I going to need to live the way I want? In fact, when surveys are done, after health, the most common concern for the average American is retirement security. And as this slide says, success is not a guarantee. If we look at the median average annual income for people over the age of 65, and this includes Social Security benefits, you can see for men, just shy of 37,000, for women, just about 22, for families, about 70. You need to know not only what your income will be in retirement, but also whether or not it's going to be sufficient to allow you to live the way you want and retire the way you want. Keep in mind, with lifestyle choices, better nutrition, safer, cleaner living conditions, and advancements in medicine, we are living longer and longer lives, which means retirement could last many, many more years than we ever expected. And we need to be financially prepared for that possibility. A popular topic today revolves around Social Security and the role that it will play during our retirement. And we are going to dive a little bit deeper into Social Security's role a little bit later. But for now, just understand the average benefit amounts for men and women. This is going back just a year and a half or so. For men, it was about 20,000, for women, about 16. We have to ask, is that going to be sufficient to allow us to retire the way that we want? And if the answer is no, then we better make sure that we're saving additional funds elsewhere to fund our retirement. And I tell everybody, the sooner you start, the better off you're going to be when retirement becomes a reality. And it happens awfully quickly. The years just go by faster and faster. Another topic to kind of bring to the table is taxes. I think it was an old elementary school teacher of mine where I first heard, life guarantees you two things: death and taxes. And that's important to understand your tax bracket at any point in time, but that can be especially true when it comes to retirement savings. If you think about it, every dollar that you put into a tax-deductible retirement plan, the government is essentially giving you a tax-free loan. They're saving you your top tax bracket. It's one of the reasons that I always encourage folks to take advantage of an employer-sponsored plan if that option exists. If it doesn't, if you're self-employed, for example, there are retirement plans that are available to you that offer the same advantages. And maybe your income changes dramatically from one year to the next. You get a bonus, you sell a business, you come into an inheritance. These are things that can be dealt with if you've done the proper planning. And one of those things that can be dealt with is something called capital gains. There are two types of capital gains tax that you might have to pay on an asset. Let me start with just a quick definition. A long-term capital gain is a gain on a security that you have held for 12 months or longer. So you bought a stock, you owned it for a year or longer, you sell it at a profit, you are going to pay a long-term capital gain rate. And you can see what those rates would be. It's one of three brackets. It's 0, 15, or 20. And so if we'll use the married filing joint return, if you make over 80,801, you're going to be in the 15% bracket, which is probably where most folks would find themselves, in that 15% bracket. If you, on the other hand, have a short-term capital gain, and short-term, the definition, you can probably guess it, is something that you've held for less than 12 months, and then you sell it at a profit. Those gains are taxed as ordinary income. So whatever tax bracket you're in, that's the gain that you're going to pay on a short-term capital gain. So it can
Can I ask a question here? Do you
Please.
pay income on your long-term capital gains tax too?
No,
Okay.
only the capital, just the long-term rate on
All
that
right.
capital gains tax. But yeah, good question. And it can be really important to understand these rates in retirement. It's also important when you're managing a portfolio of taxable investments. You don't want to cause yourself more tax needlessly. It happens all the time that, hey, if I had just held this for X number of months, I could have gone from a 24% tax rate at my income level down to 0 or 15. So paying attention to that and planning for it can be awfully important. You also should have an idea about how, when, and from where you're going to derive income during retirement. Is the income going to be sufficient to cover your expenses? And are you doing it in the most tax efficient manner? It's better if we can answer these questions before we retire, because there might not be a whole heck of a lot that we can do about it after retirement. And I have a real life example that we'll talk about in a minute that proves that point. But we want to make sure that we do this type of exercise before we retire, because the last thing we'd want to do is spend part of retirement looking for a job because we found out too late that our income wasn't sufficient to meet our needs. The same thing is true with taxes and your rate of return and how they impact your total retirement income. Again, do this exercise before you retire so you can make adjustments as needed, because you don't want to, again, find out that you have to somehow learn to live on less money or find a way to supplement your income in retirement. The benefit of knowing all of this sooner is it allows you to make informed decisions. So maybe you find out that, hey, if I just save X number of dollars more, I'll be able to retire much more comfortably. Or if no one wants to hear this, but if I work a few more years, my retirement is likely to be much more secure. And again, the sooner you know that, the better off you'll be in terms of any adjustments that might need to be made. You'll certainly have different resources available to you, including Social Security, maybe a company retirement plan, or your own individual IRA, or a personal portfolio, or most likely a combination of all of those things. So let's talk about each of those in a little more detail, starting with Social Security. And I'm not here to tell you what the future holds for Social Security. That could be a whole different topic and seminar. But I will tell you that you shouldn't count on Social Security alone to provide you with your retirement income. And if we kind of pull the system apart a little bit to get a better understanding of why it's in transition, if you look back to 1950, when Social Security was first coming into being, there were over 16 workers for every one retired person. And then you can see as we fast forward to 2020, that ratio is now 3 to 1. There are 3 workers supporting every one retired person. It's projected that by the year 2035, it's going to be closer to 2 to 1. And there are 2 big reasons for this transition. We're living longer and we're having less kids. So you put those 2 things together and you say something has to give eventually. So Social Security funding and its future, they're discussed by Congress all the time. It's always a hot topic. It will continue to be a hot topic. Again, I'm not here to make a political statement about what's going to happen to Social Security. I'm just saying, don't count on it to provide the bulk of your retirement income. It will be there to provide some. But if it's all that you've got, you might want to start planning and saving sooner. Let's talk a little bit about expenses and inflation and the impact that those have on our ability to retire the way that we want. Regularly, people mistakenly tell me that inflation won't impact their life as much during retirement. We don't have to look very far to see how inflation can impact our life, right? If you've been to the gas pump lately, you've seen a real life example of it. We've seen a spike in inflation running at 7% presently. In retirement, many of the expenses you face are every bit as sensitive to inflation as they were while you were working. You've got medical care, housing, family, education, leisure. It is likely that you will spend at least the same amount in retirement as you did before. And again, a lot of those items are just as or even more inflation sensitive. And let's talk a little bit about inflation since it's been such a hot topic. And I know, by the way, when I say inflation, everyone just kind of understands the concept and what that means. But I do think we conjure up images of big double-digit stick-around inflation like we saw in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. I'm going to tell you today that even though it can be scary, that's not the type of inflation that we should be overly concerned with. We should be really concerned with average core inflation of 3 to 4%. And anyone who doubts that, if you're 60 or thereabout, you can do a quick exercise with me and just think about what you paid for the first house you ever purchased and get that number in mind. Now think about what you paid for the last car you bought. You say, okay, that's average core inflation at work. We need to make sure our retirement dollars are staying ahead of inflation. And if you look at the chart here, you're going to see, we ran this back to 1920 something. From 1926 to a year ago, inflation averaged about 3%. If we take out a couple of world wars and look at the post-World War II average, it's closer to 3.5%, closer to 4%. Let's talk a little bit about the current environment where we're seeing 7% inflation. Why has that occurred? Simply put, we had a worldwide pandemic. It slowed down the production and transportation of goods around the world, and that made it harder for you to get your hands on things that you wanted. When that occurs, prices go up. It's go back to your, economics 101 class. It's all about supply and demand. As the supply chain gets back in working order, we expect to see an ease in that supply demand equation. Now, we also have Russia and Ukraine, and that's an additional issue. And we're not sure yet what that will bring. But the Federal Reserve has a number of tools at its disposal to fight price increases. They've said they'll use whatever is necessary to do that. I won't get into a debate about how long the current inflationary environment is going to persist. But I will say again, we should be concerned with core 3 to 4% inflation and making sure we stay ahead of that so that we're not losing purchasing power as the years go by. Let's talk about what that means in terms of a return on our investment, whatever that investment is. I use just a 5% example here and talk about the dynamics behind a 5% return on an investment. If we earn 5, we're assuming here we're in a 24% tax bracket. So we subtract taxes, our return is down to 3.8. Then we subtract average inflation of 3%. Our net true return is less than 1%. Is that going to be sufficient to allow us to achieve our goals after you consider inflation and taxation? In today's environment, where we've been living with really, really low interest rates, if you lock into an investment like a CD, for example, the good news is you've got a guaranteed rate of return. Guess what the bad news is? You got a guaranteed rate of return. It's never going to be higher. So if we're locking in and we've got a 5 or a 10-year CD, as interest rates move back up, our CD is worth less and less. Because if you bought a 2% CD and a year later, I can get one for 3, your 2% CD isn't all that attractive. So the question is my return going to be enough to offset inflation and taxation? And let's talk about how we approach investing in order to keep ahead of this inflation and taxation issue. I'm not going to get too technical here, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about a concept called asset allocation. Asset allocation goes back many, many years. The people who developed this theory won a Nobel Prize for their work in this area. There is a reason that you hear asset allocation. There's a reason it's a textbook principle. It's because it works. And what is it? Asset allocation is the theory of attempting to contain risk or volatility, engineering a return that is in line with your investment objective. It avoids overconcentration in any particular sector or industry, and then attempts to dampen volatility by really just doing 2 very basic things. avoid correlation, which is when things move in the same direction during the same period. So you avoid that and you utilize covariance. Covariance is just things moving in opposite directions of each other. So you do this, you find what your proper asset allocation model is, how much should I have in stocks, bonds, cash, real estate, et cetera. And then that's a good, important first step. But once you've determined what your appropriate asset allocation model is, you have to move on to the next step. And then you have to start to allocate the appropriate pieces to each of these categories. So for example, let's pretend we want to fill in the large cap portion of our portfolio. What are we going to use to do it? Maybe mutual funds, maybe individual stocks, probably a combination of both. We'll talk a little bit later about how to select from the many, many available options when it comes to putting a portfolio together. But just understand that while determining the proper asset allocation model for yourself is very critical, it is the first step as you start to put a portfolio together. Portfolios aren't just stocks, bonds and cash. Within stocks, you have large companies, small companies, medium-sized companies, international companies, et cetera. And the same is true on the bond side. So there are lots of different categories that we have to kind of fill in the pieces. And I like this chart, even though it's busy. And I'll explain what it is. This is simply the broad asset classes that exist, right? Stocks, bonds, international, small cap, large cap. And it shows each of these lines represents a year, all right? So, and this goes back over the last decade. You can look and see which asset class had the best performance each year and which one had the worst performance. So let's look at one that kind of moved around a good bit. And it's called MSCI EAFE. It's the international kind of emerging markets. There are some years where it is way at the top, other years where it's way at the bottom. And you can basically see that for every asset class that's in there. They bounce around from top to bottom. But then you also see this yellow kind of highlighted box that's almost always right in the middle. That yellow highlight is an asset allocated portfolio. And basically what it is it's a combination of all of the asset categories put together. You'll notice never at the top. Guess what? It's also never at the bottom. That's the idea behind asset allocation. You engineer a portfolio that has certain risk and return parameters, and then you're able to go through the market's ups and downs. And this slide happens to be one of my favorites. It says fluctuation is going to happen, but don't panic. This is the cost of missing the best days, in this case, the stock market. This goes back to 2000, so we've got 20 years here. Had you been invested in only the S&P 500 over that time period, and you stayed fully invested the entire time, you would have returned a little better than 6% per year. If you missed just the 10 best days during that 20-year period, your return went from 6 to 2.5. If you missed the 20 best days, now you went from 6 to basically flat. You missed the 30 best, now you've turned negative, 40, 50, 60, et cetera, you can see. It is only by staying fully invested that we can potentially reap the rewards of the best days that the market provides. The market, I know news stories like it because it's a flashy headline when the market goes down, but the market reacts just as violently on the upside. It is so difficult, and I'll say impossible, to know when to be in and when to be out from a year by year basis. And if you think that's difficult, here's a daily return for the S&P 500. If you think it's hard to do it year by year, try doing it day by day. I mean, the market is just, I mean, it looks, you know, like it'd be impossible to know when to be in and when to be out. And that's because it is. It is just too hard to know when to be in, when to be out, and successfully time the market. On top of that, there will always be a reason not to invest. You can, this chart goes back over the last 35 years or so and shows some of the reasons that you wouldn't want to invest. One of the things that I hear a lot, and it's become one of my favorite things, is I hear from somebody that, yeah, I see all of that stuff, but this time it's different. No, it isn't. It comes wrapped in different packaging, but it really isn't different from all of the other events that the market has seen come and go. And we're going to see more significant events over the next 35 years that the market will see come and go. I do a separate seminar on just this topic that might be fun sometime if we do it again. But the bottom line is this. In 1986, the S&P 500 closed at 211. At the end of 2020, the S&P closed at 3,756. That's about a 9% return on average. We will always have reasons that make it look scary, but if you have a plan in place and an allocation that you can withstand the ups and the downs, makes it a whole lot easier to withstand whatever this world throws at us. But how do we then take our money when it's time to start living on these assets and these savings that we've built up, right? Because while we're working, we lived on the income that we earned each year. It was pretty easy. In retirement, now all of a sudden, hey, I have to rely on these other sources. There are a bunch of things that you have to consider when you start to take money from your accounts in retirement, including your age. We talked about 59 and a half. There are some other age considerations. Inflation, talked about that. Longevity, how long are you going to live? And of course, we don't know that, but we have to plan that we are going to live. And last thing we want is to end up outliving our money. Taxes, market conditions. Let's talk about those. Now, let's also talk about which bucket of money, bringing our buckets back in here, which bucket of money is most beneficial for our situation. I had a real life example that occurred just last year with a client. Was a woman who retired a little on the early side, not real early, but a little bit on the early side. But she had the ability to retire, live the way she wanted to live. And then just a year or so into her retirement, somebody came along, offered her a consulting job that was going to pay a pretty sizable bonus upon completion later that year. She was concerned, and rightly so, about taxes because she had been living on distributions from her IRA account, which were fully taxable. So now she's saying, okay, I'm taking these distributions, they're taxable, I'm going to get this bonus, it's going to throw me up into another bracket. Fortunately, she also had a Roth IRA account. Now, it wasn't huge, but it was enough in this Roth account that we were able to stop the distributions from the regular IRA, start them from the Roth IRA, which she was able to take tax-free. So no tax on that. She was then able to receive the bonus upon completion, and she didn't get thrown up into another tax bracket and get clobbered with a tax bill. So having that bucket available, even though it wasn't a sizable bucket, it was enough to allow her to get through that particular circumstance that year. Without the Roth bucket, there wasn't going to be much she could do except end up with a pretty sizable tax bill. Here's another good example. We like to use big numbers because it looks better. So we came up with Joe and Mary Sample. They were 55, wanted to retire 10 years down the road. They had a net worth of $3 million. They were currently saving a total of $18,000 between the two of them. They wanted to be able to spend about $180,000 a year in retirement. We assumed inflation of 3.5. Their current rate of return was just shy of 5. So we took that all into consideration, ran some scenarios and said, okay, this is what retirement's going to look like. Lots of numbers on this page. Don't get too overwhelmed by them. If you just look at the far right, where it says total portfolio assets, they started at 3.1 million. By the time they retired, they almost had 5. But then with their spending and their rate of return, you can see where the numbers turn red when they hit 89. Red is bad. Red means they ran out of money. And you might say, okay, hey, made it till 89. That's not bad. And I've also heard people say, you know, the old joke that, oh, I hope my check to the funeral home bounces because that means I timed everything perfectly. Okay. For most people, or many people anyway, they want to leave something to the next generation or to the causes that they care about. So by making just a couple of adjustments, we didn't do anything too radical here. We changed 2 things. We said, hey, instead of only saving 18,000, increase that to 30,000 for the next 10 years. And instead of earning 5%, earn 6%. You can see what a difference it makes. Now, I mean, now not only do they not run out of money, they still have a multi-million-dollar portfolio when they're 95. It's 3.7 million. Had they done this exercise at 65 at retirement, would have been a different set of circumstances. They would have had to have figured out how to reduce spending or something else, or take on more risk than they were willing to. But they gave themselves that 10-year window to say, okay, if we can sock away some more money, we can do what we want and live on what we want. We also can't forget about the importance of how to invest these different buckets of money. You know, I've told you about these 3 different buckets, but how do we invest? Do we invest them all the same? Maybe it makes sense to have highly taxable investments inside of our IRA or Roth IRA account. And if we are currently in a high tax bracket and we have a personal taxable investment account, maybe we consider things like municipal bonds where the interest is tax-free, or individual stocks where we can control the ultimate payment of capital gains tax. You put that all together, you start to get a withdrawal plan in place that can be adapted to as life changes. I almost forgot, I talked earlier about how do you select from all of the stuff that's out there, and especially mutual funds. You know, it was in the 80s at some point where there were literally a handful of mutual funds. You know, mutual funds were for the really, really wealthy, the Mellons and the Carnegies. Fast forward to today, there are over 27,000 US mutual funds right now. Of those, about 25,000 are open to new investors. So if we go back to our scenario and pretend that we're looking to fill our large cap value portion of our asset allocation model, we set some criteria. We look for funds that have a better than average 3-year track record. Well, now we've narrowed it down to 129. Then we say, hey, we want funds that have consistently outperformed their peers and done that with lower fees. Now we have it narrowed down to just 19 funds. That is a much more reasonable list to sort through, right? So you have to come up with the criteria that's important to you. We have a system for screening funds. We use both qualitative and quantitative factors to score the funds, not only for the initial selection, but very importantly for the ongoing, to make sure that the fund or the fund manager hasn't changed from one year to the next. And you might be surprised at how often that can happen in the mutual fund world. When a quarterback in the NFL has a good year and their contract is up, there are other teams that come calling. It isn't all that different in the mutual fund world. Someone that builds up a good track record, there are other folks who want them. So you might buy a fund that has a great track record only to learn the manager who built up that track record left last year. So you've got to do a little more digging other than just saying, give me the one that's performed the best. But that at least gives you an idea of kind of how you start to sort through this. Your goals should always be the starting point when you're building any kind of a portfolio. You want to establish the proper ratio of stocks to bonds that reflects your objectives, your risk tolerance, and you want to be sure you're using all of the categories of both equities and fixed income to maximize your opportunity and manage risk. Everybody's pie chart is going to look a little bit different, and it should. How you draw income is also going to depend on your unique situation, and that may change from one year to the next, as we saw in the example I gave. So remember, there are lots of considerations for a successful retirement. This little chart here helps remind us of some of the more critical aspects. We've got to determine what our goals are, analyze where we are, where we want to be, create a plan. And up until that point, by the way, you've done a lot of good stuff. But if you don't take the next step and implement, then it's all just been kind of academic. So then we have to implement, we have to monitor and adjust. And that doesn't mean that we tear it up every time the market has a little bit of a blip. We monitor, we adjust as necessary. And then you do exactly what you're doing here tonight. You continue to educate yourself. And if you need a little help along the way, talk to a qualified professional who can help guide you to and through your unique set of circumstances. So with that, I'll shut up and turn it back over to Chuck to see if there's anything else or any questions that have come in. And I think we still have a little more time to chat.
I do got a few questions, Mike. For savings and buying stocks and bonds, 401k or 403b, what's a good ratio of percentage of your income to save?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I will say that I tell people that if you can put away 10% of your income, you are ahead of most of your peers. The United States happens to be one of the worst savers, especially when it comes to retirement. I can't remember exactly what our number is, but it's a very low single-digit rate that we have currently. But if you can put away 10%, and by the way, whether it's in a 401k, 403b, or even in just to a personal account, I tell people that the best way to save that money is to have it in some kind of an automatic deduction program. Do it before the money ever gets to you, because once it gets to you, what are the chances that it's going to get into that? I mean, it's probably going to go to something that's a little more fun, especially when I talk to younger folks and it's like, what, I'm going to put this away into something that I can't touch for 10, 20, 30 years. There's no fun in that. So do it so that it automatically comes out before you ever see it. And if you're doing 10%, you are ahead of most folks.
Okay. Yeah, well, when you're young, you're invincible and nothing bad ever is going to happen. We've all been there.
Yes.
For your house, now you're talking about planning for, your estate, because none of us are getting out of here, alive. Does your children, if they inherit the house, do they pay an inheritance tax on there, or what happens? Because that's most people's biggest investment in their lives.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, typically the largest asset we have is the house that we've been in. And yes, there is now in Pennsylvania, I forget which administration it was under, but we did away with what they used to call the widow's tax, which was even when it went from one spouse to another, there used to be some taxation. That no longer applies. Yeah, so fortunately that was done away with a while back. Now, however, when it does pass on to the next generation, you do have Pennsylvania inheritance tax. And you might have to check me on these numbers, but there are different percentages that are due if you're passing to linear descendants. So if it goes kids, grandkids, et cetera, it's, I believe, 4.5% inheritance tax. If it's passing to non-linear descendants, then I believe it's 10%, and everybody else is 15%. So yeah, there is some taxation. And you sometimes hear people say, well, I'll just put the house in the name of the kids then to avoid that. That comes with a whole other set of issues that you have to deal with. So there are things that you really need to think through before you just say, hey, in order to avoid this 4.5% tax, I'm going to put the house in my son's name. Then you realize, oh boy, I just made a gift. Now there are gift tax consequences. So there are some things you've got to consider before you just go ahead and make those. And that's definitely a legal and financial issue.
Well, they're getting some money one way or the other.
Yes.
Okay.
They have thought through all of the loopholes and figured out a way to tighten those up.
Two other things. Debt ratio to income. Where should you be at below, and what disasters it's gonna, I guess, bankrupt you is what I want to ask.
Yeah, if it's in the 50-50 range, I would say that's kind of the trouble zone. So if you tilt and now my debt is more than 50, now I'm really starting to have concerns. But a more reasonable is that 30% range, which is where a lot of folks find themselves. But if you start getting more than 50% debt to equity, yeah, you're going to have a hard time saving and even qualifying for loans.
Now, speaking of that, do you take it by your monthly income, that ratio, or do you take it by your yearly income?
Yeah, you can do it either way. It's probably a little more accurate if you do it month by month, especially depending on what type of job you have, because there's some folks, in commission-based industries that can fluctuate significantly. So yeah, it's probably a little more accurate to do it monthly, but either way, we like to see a kind of a full net worth snapshot to say, hey, here's my assets, here are my liabilities. And one of the things that maybe people don't do as often as we'd like to see is, instead of carrying high debt level items like big credit card debt, if you own a home and you have some equity, let's get that into a potentially tax deductible home equity loan, pay off the high interest stuff, and get into a plan that's a little more manageable, and you're not paying 18, 19, 25% interest to the credit card companies.
Okay. Now, speaking of saving for retirement, you have single people, married people. If you're married, is it better to do a joint IRA, or, is there advantages to that instead of each having their own 401k?
Yeah, interestingly, the rules with IRAs, similar to 401ks, they can only be in one name. So there is no joint IRA account. If you have an IRA, it is only in your name. If your spouse has one, it's only in his or her name. The only joint property you can have are non-qualified assets, like personal accounts, annuities, those types of things. But IRAs and 401ks are only for individuals. And we tell folks that depending on the plan, I've had couples where one had a 401k plan that had, a significant number of options that were available. The other had one where there weren't a ton of options. So we said, hey, if we're going to overfund one of these versus the other, let's go with the one where we've got more options. But the other thing that you have to consider is, most times there is some degree of an employer match. By law, there has to be some kind of match with most of these plans that are set up. So we said, hey, you're both going to do at least, if there's a match up to 3%, we're going to do at least 3%. Then if we want to fund one more than the other, we'll look at the plan that has better options, lower fees, et cetera, and build that one up a little bit more.
Okay, just two more quick questions. Social Security, your monthly benefit is based on what, your last 3 years of working?
It's
Your
actually,
highest free income?
yeah, it's a really convoluted calculation that Social Security does, but it is based actually on your highest 35 years of work history. So they take the highest 35. So if, when you started out, you weren't making much, and then you worked for 40 years, they'll throw out those lower years, and then they average the highest 35.
Last thing, we've seen a lot of TV commercials for these lately, reverse mortgages. Just can you give us a real quick what they are? Are they actually a benefit, or is it I don't know.
Yeah, I think like every industry on the planet, there are bad actors all over the place. I have them in my industry, doctors have them, lawyers have them, people who work in the reverse mortgage industry, I'm sure have them. But I have seen and been intimately involved with some reverse mortgage situations. If they're done right with a good company, it can be a lifeline for someone, because like you said before, Chuck, a lot of times the biggest asset we have is our house. And if people have no other options and they say, look, we'd like for the house to eventually go to the kids, but we don't have any income to live on. So we're going to have to sell it and move into something smaller, et cetera. A reverse mortgage in certain situations, if that's kind of the last resort, they're not all bad. There are certainly some good reputable companies that do that. And for some people, it can work.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions we have. I want to thank you, Mike, and we will certainly have you back again to talk about other financial aspects. I want to thank you, Bethel Park. Thank you for listening, and we will be back March 16th with a topic on addiction. So good night, Bethel Park, and see you on March 16th.